The Daily Derech. We are walking the path of holiness.
Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein. Welcome to the Daily Derech. Today is the first day after Shabbat Kodesh, the 26th of Adar, 5786, corresponding in the secular calendar to Sunday, March 15th, 2026. We will read Parashat Vayikra this coming Shabbat, and we are 17 days from Pesach. Let's begin. Let's begin with Me'am Loez on Parashat Vayikra. We'll start with the first verse of the Parsha and also the first verse of the book of Leviticus. It goes like this. Vayikra el Moshe, Vayidaber Adonai elav me'ohel moed lemor. And the Lord called to Moshe and spoke to him out of the tent of meeting, saying, this verse is the beginning of the book of Vayikra, and it's a verse of calling out to Moshe. And many commentators ask the classic question, why does God need to call out to Moses first and then speak to him? Why specifically does God need to call out to Moses? Can't God just speak to him? Why calling first? Well, it's important to understand the setting. The Mishkan was just created in the wilderness. We learned in the last parshiot of the book of Exodus that the Mishkan was built, and now God was ready to dwell in that place. And we know in the first two parshiot of the book of Leviticus, we're going to learn about all the sacrifices that need to happen before the tabernacle is actually initiated for divine service. But the Mishkan was completed. And Moses was told that God would speak to Moses in front of the ark cover in the tent of meeting. So Moses already knew that that was the place in which God would speak to him once it was erected. Yet we're told by our rabbis that Moses was a little afraid to go in. He made a logical inference. He said, I know with Mount Sinai, when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, the whole mountain was considered holy, and no one can approach and come close to the mountain unless invited. Eventually, God called to Moshe to ascend the mountain and receive the Ten Commandments and the Torah, but we know that that was only after invitation. And so Moshe came to the conclusion through logical inference that if that was the way it was at Mount Sinai, where God's presence only dwelled for a temporary time, all the more so in the location where God's presence would dwell permanently, how much more so does Moshe have to be filled with yirah, need to be filled with awe and trepidation from just walking and waltzing into God's home, into the tent of meeting? But we know that God wanted to speak to Moshe. God wanted Moshe to come in. And so what did God do? God called out to Moshe and said, Moshe, come in. It's okay. Thank you for your humility. Thank you for your care and your respect of me. And so now that you've seen that, come inside because I have something to tell you. And that's what this verse is all about. And I think Moshe is showing us very clearly how we should relate to Hashem. Obviously, many of us want to be close to Hashem. It's a really important part of Judaism to be close to Hashem. But too many people often talk about how we should just be best friends with Hashem, that we should speak to God just like a close friend, and that's about it. But God is not just a friend. God is not some just close companion. It's not an equal relationship. God is all-powerful. God is the creator of the universe, the source of everything. We shouldn't just walk in. If we understand God's true power and how important God is, and with how much respect we should treat God, we shouldn't just walk in and waltz in and do whatever we want, but rather we should treat God with awe. And by doing this, within our mind, actually psychologically, God's image is lifted up for us, and we end up treating God more like God. The problem is when we treat God like a common friend, then God becomes, just a common friend and not actually the Lord of the universe. And so it's so important to act like Moshe, to not just all the time just say, oh, God's with me, I could just say whatever I want, but to be careful what we say to Hashem and how we say that to God. Are we acting respectfully? And really take advantage also at the times when we're supposed to be praying to Hashem, like the davening times, like 3 times a day when we're supposed to say the Amidah or the prayers that we're supposed to say. We should really take advantage of those times and really lean into them. They're precious moments where we've been invited in by God to speak to God. But at other times, sometimes it's worth saying, okay, now is not the time to pray. It's the time to do mitzvot, to be good in the world, and to look forward to those precious times throughout the day when we get to actually speak to Hashem and we're actually invited into the Ohel Moed and we're invited into the temple of meeting. And also not to be frustrated when we feel like we're outside the tent of meeting. That's natural. We have to kind of wait to be invited. And now you can pray to be invited, to desire to be invited into the Ohel Moed. But sometimes we're not going to be able to get in all the time. And that's what it is to worship a God who's higher than us, who's different than us, who's not an equal, who's all-powerful and creates the universe at every moment. Let's now turn to the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. We'll continue learning the laws of Pesach. We're in the 3rd chapter on the 13th halacha of the Rambam's laws of leavened and unleavened bread. We're going to learn about the now uncommon scenario, but does happen, when Pesach begins on Motzi Shabbat. When Pesach, the holiday, actually begins on Saturday night. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, we learned that the day before Pesach, the 14th of Nisan, which in this case falls on Shabbat, we have a lot of things to do, right? We have to search for the chametz at night by candlelight, and then we have to destroy the chametz in the morning, and then we have to do a lot of different things. And so the question is, what can we actually do on Shabbat? We also have a problem that on Shabbat, we actually have to eat bread. We know for the evening meal and lunchtime meal, or the second meal of the day, during the day, we have to eat bread. And maybe and usually you would think at Suda Shlishit as well. So what do? Well, according to the Rambam, and this is usually the common tradition, is that you actually move the search for chametz earlier. Now, you might ask, what's the problem with searching for chametz on Shabbat? Well, number one problem is the candle, right? We're forbidden to ignite a candle on Shabbat. And yes, we do light a candle before Shabbat, but once the candle is lit on Shabbat, before Shabbat begins, we are forbidden to touch it in the laws of what is called uMatzah. It's actually forbidden to touch a candle even and move it once it's lit. And also, even beyond the idea that it's uMatzah, it's something that you just can't touch. It doesn't have a use on Shabbat in that way. It's also something where if you move the candle, the fire might move and melt some of the wax, and therefore you might actually be igniting something separately on Shabbat, which would then, of course, be at least a rabbinic violation, if not a Torah violation itself of Shabbat. So therefore, what we do is we actually move up the search for chametz to the 13th of Nisan, the evening of the 13th of Nisan. So in this case, that would be Thursday night. So if Pesach fell on Saturday night, then the search for chametz would be on Thursday night, and the nullification and everything like that would be, we have to get rid of the chametz at least on Friday. And now we do have to leave some chametz around, so we eat chametz on Friday night. And so we can have a challah or something on Friday night, but if you eat the second meal before the 4th hour of the day, so before about halachic 10 o'clock in the morning, yes, then you can have chametz. But after the 4th hour, we know that according to our rabbis, we're not allowed to eat chametz anymore, and we actually have to get rid of it. So what we actually do is we only put enough chametz aside that we're going to be able to eat by the time of that 10 o'clock hour. And then we put the rest of the chametz away or destroy it before Pesach on Friday. And we then make sure that if there's any chametz left over that we didn't finish, we destroy it some way. So it's either you can flush it down the toilet or do something like crumple it up and pour some disgusting liquid on it or something and put it in the garbage, something like that. And that's why it's good to have only a very little bit of chametz left over that you're actually going to be eating on Shabbat. Very, very important. Now, this year, Pesach does not fall on Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach, the 14th of Nisan, does not fall on Shabbat. So we don't have to worry about this year, but it's just an interesting case, and it's also something important because it does happen, and it's good to know what to do when that happens. Let's end with Menorat HaMaor. We're going to continue learning Menorat HaMaor on Pesach, but this is the second chapter. We actually went through the entire first chapter of the section of Menorat HaMaor on Pesach. So now we're on the second chapter. And now it becomes clear what the Menorat HaMaor is doing. The Menorat HaMaor is going to try to tell the story of Pesach and the freedom of the Jewish people from servitude through the Midrash. Sort of similar what the Haggadah itself does, but in a little bit of a different way. So where we're up to, we've been talking previously in the first chapter about this sort of the prelude to going down to Egypt, right? The prophecy of Avraham, the Brit Bein HaBeitarim, the covenant between the parts, how God tells him that his ancestors will be enslaved and go through darkness, and sort of we learn the whole meaning, but the Shekhinah will follow them, the indwelling presence of God will follow them. But now, when do the Jewish people actually go down to Egypt? Well, the first time they actually go down to Egypt is in the time of Jacob. We know that after Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, we know the famous story that Joseph had the dream with Pharaoh and saved a bunch of food because he knew there was going to be a famine. And so Egypt becomes a safe place where food is given out during this famine that affected the whole area. So even Jacob and his sons and his whole family needed to go down to Egypt to procure food. We're told that Jacob's going down to Egypt actually marked the active moment when the exile really began. This was already 190 years after Isaac was born, but it's 200 now. It's going to be 210 years until the Jewish people are actually freed from Egypt. But of course, when the Jews go down to Egypt, it's not like they're immediately enslaved. There's still going to be a good while of time until they're actually going to be enslaved, although they live in Egypt and not in Eretz Israel anymore. So when did it actually begin? When did the harsh enslavement of the Jewish people actually begin? Well, it began after the death of Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's son. And remember, Joseph's the reason, really, that Egypt became this strong powerhouse that was able to save everybody else from the famine due to his dreams and his ability to interpret the dreams, and then his great strategy as a minister in the Egyptian government. So Joseph was very, very appreciated. Jacob, we know, is appreciated throughout by the Egyptians as well, but Joseph is very much appreciated. And as long as Joseph was alive, the Jewish people weren't oppressed, and Joseph stood up for the Jewish people, and because of Joseph's great honor and great wisdom and great respect from the Egyptian public, the Jewish people were not oppressed. But once Joseph passes away, and all of his brothers as well, we know that things change, and we're going to study that. We're going to learn more about how things particularly change and why they particularly change. But in this case, we're going to focus here on the death of Joseph, right? Why did it change right after the death of Joseph? And what does that have to teach us? I think when Jews don't just apply themselves to Torah, inner stuff of Jewish community, but when they actually act to care about non-Jews and care about the society around them and try to do good for everybody, oftentimes they gain respect amongst non-Jews. And this is something that we Jews have done for a very, very long time, to try to not just do good for ourselves, but to do good for everybody, that we are one, with the idea that really we are all children of God, not just the Jewish people, but everyone's children of God. And by doing good for others, it creates the sort of respectability for the whole entire community as a whole. Now, this is not foolproof. We know this, right? So it shouldn't be dependent on that we have to have these respectful people, otherwise there's just going to be so much more anti-Semitism, right? Not really true. There still could be a lot of anti-Semitism. There's, been many, many governments in which there has been horrible anti-Semitism, and even when there have been Jewish ministers in the government. But at least we know from Joseph that it is a good thing to have a connection to the government authorities, because it sometimes helps us to actually protect Jewish life and protect the Jewish people from oppression. This is one of the really positive reasons that the Jews should be involved in government. But I really want to say that it's just so important to understand that this is not a hard and fast rule. We shouldn't expect that we're going to be safe no matter what just because we have Jews up in high positions in the government. Things can always get bad, but we are taught from this parsha that it does help. And so it's very important that we have Jewish politicians, that we have Jews who are within our American government here and proud Americans, and of course being a proud part of American society. In our next class, we'll learn more in Menorat HaMaor about Joseph's death and exactly what happened there. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Daily Derech. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me anytime at rmr@templeofaaron.org. Thank you so much for listening. There are so many people to thank, and you can look in the show notes for that. And also, if you want to know and see any of these texts in the original, we actually have that too. You can actually find that in our episode description. So look in each of the episode descriptions and you'll find that information right there. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.